He hadn't meant to follow her. Not really. It had started with a feeling, the kind that presses into the ribs and refuses to leave. She'd said she was meeting a friend for a late dinner, but her voice had carried a tremor he hadn't heard before. That tremor stayed with him long after she stepped out the door, and eventually he found himself in the car, engine running, headlights off, trailing her from just far enough away that she would never suspect. The night was thick with humidity and noise, the city restless even at this hour. He kept expecting her to turn toward the quiet restaurant she claimed she was headed to, but instead she slipped into a different part of town entirely, the kind of district that never slept, where the sidewalks gleamed with neon and the air throbbed with bass. When he saw her pull over near the nightclub, his breath stalled. She stepped out quickly, smoothing her dress, checking her reflection in the window, looking nervous but excited. And something inside him tightened in a way he couldn't name. He parked and approached on foot, staying to the shadows while people spilled in and out of the entrance, laughter and smoke rising above their heads. The bouncer waved her in without hesitation, as if she had been there before. He waited a moment, then slipped inside as well. The music hit him first, heavy, relentless, followed by flashes of red and blue lights slicing through the dark. Bodies moved like a single creature, a sea of limbs and heat. It took time for his eyes to adjust, but when they did, he found her tucked near the bar, and beside her was a man he had never seen before. Tall, confident, with a smile that seemed rehearsed yet effortlessly charming. She leaned toward him, brushing hair behind her ear, laughing in a way he hadn't heard from her in months. The stranger's hand lingered near her elbow, and she didn't pull away. A pulse of cold spread through his chest. He watched as she spoke with an eagerness he hadn't seen directed at him in far too long. He couldn't hear the words, only the rhythm of them, her voice rising slightly, his dropping low. The two weaving together like an inside joke with no space for anyone else. Twice she touched her necklace, a nervous habit he knew well, but instead of breaking the moment, it seemed to draw the stranger closer. At one point the man leaned in, saying something directly into her ear, and she smiled with a softness that felt like a knife. He realized then that whatever was happening had roots deeper than a random encounter. This wasn't accidental. This was a meeting, deliberate and practiced. When the stranger placed a hand lightly over hers, she hesitated only a second before letting it stay. The music swelled around them, but he heard none of it. He felt only the sinking, the spiraling sense that he was witnessing something he was never meant to see. Then came the moment he knew he would remember for the rest of his life. The stranger stood, offering his hand. She looked down at it, uncertainty flickering, but just for a heartbeat. Then she slipped her fingers into his, letting him pull her to her feet. They spoke briefly, too quietly for him to decipher. She glanced toward the exit, then back at the man, and whatever she saw in his face seemed to settle her doubts. Together they moved through the crowd, hand in hand, disappearing between shifting bodies and drifting smoke. He followed at a distance, stomach knotted, throat dry. The cold air outside hit him like a shock. He watched as they crossed the street toward the parking lot, still talking intimately, still walking too close. When they reached the stranger's car, a dark, sleek shape under a flickering street lamp, the man opened the door for her with practiced ease. She hesitated again, gripping the frame, looking around as if searching the night for a reason to stop. But she didn't stop. She got in. The door closed softly, almost politely, and that softness was the part that hurt the most. He stood there among the shadows, watching the taillights flare to life, watching the car pull away into the dark, carrying with it the version of her he no longer recognized. When silence settled again, the nightclub lights kept flashing behind him, indifferent and cold, painting the pavement in colors that felt bright for a night that had just broken something so quietly and completely. He didn't go home. That would have meant accepting what he'd seen, letting the night end with nothing but unanswered questions and the hollow echo of a closing car door. Instead, he stood motionless in the parking lot, long after the nightclub noise faded into something distant and abstract. The street lamp above him flickered, buzzing softly, bathing the pavement in a sickly yellow glow that made everything feel unreal. It took minutes, maybe more, before he could breathe normally again. The weight in his chest felt heavy enough to anchor him to the asphalt, but eventually he forced himself to move, each step stiff and mechanical as if his body had forgotten how to carry him forward. He walked back to his car, hands trembling when he reached for the door handle, and sat there in the dark, staring at the steering wheel, the dashboard, anything that wasn't the memory of her stepping into another man's car with quiet acceptance. He told himself he wouldn't follow them. that it would be crossing a line he had already stepped too close to. But the thought of going home alone, sitting in a silent living room while imagining everything that might be happening elsewhere, felt unbearable. So he started the engine, headlights sweeping across the emptying lot, and drove out onto the street in the direction they had gone. The city seemed different now, harsher, sharper, its lights too bright and its shadows too deep. Traffic thinned as he left the busy district behind, guided only by the faint hope that he might catch sight of their car again. He didn't know what he would do if he did. He only knew that not knowing was worse than anything he might find. The road led him past rows of shuttered shops, dim apartments, and quiet intersections. He kept scanning the distance, searching every turn, every pair of taillights, every shadow. Twice he thought he spotted the right shape, the right color, only for the cars to pass under streetlights and reveal different models, different silhouettes. He muttered to himself, urging the universe to give him something, anything, even as the logical part of his mind whispered that the city was too large, that he had lost them the moment he hesitated. But then, just as he turned onto a quieter street lined with trees whose branches hung low over the road, he saw it, a familiar dark shape pulled to the side, parked beneath a canopy of leaves that rustled softly in the night breeze. His pulse leapt. He slowed, allowing his car to drift past without attracting attention. The stranger's vehicle sat there silently, headlights off, engine dark, looking like a sleeping animal waiting to wake. There was no movement inside, no silhouettes, no voices. He drove a little farther, heart pounding hard enough to shake his vision, and parked half a block away. For several moments he couldn't bring himself to get out. His breath fogged the windshield in quick bursts, and the night outside felt suddenly too vast, too quiet, as though holding its breath with him. When he finally opened the door, the air that greeted him was cold enough to sting. He walked slowly, careful not to make noise, his footsteps crunching softly against stray leaves scattered along the sidewalk. The windows of the stranger's car were tinted, hiding everything inside. He hesitated at a distance, unable to ignore the sharp contrast between his frantic thoughts and the stillness of the scene before him. It almost looked peaceful, just a parked car beneath rustling branches, nothing more. But he knew better. He could feel the truth pressing against the edges of his mind, trying to force its way in. With each step closer, the ache in his chest deepened, pulling memories along with it. Their first year together, the late-night talks, the shared plans, the promises whispered in moments that had once felt unshakable. He didn't approach the car directly. Instead, he lingered near the edge of the sidewalk, half hidden behind a tree trunk, unsure of what he hoped to see. The windows revealed nothing. The silence revealed less. His thoughts churned, questions spiraling into one another, why she had lied, who the stranger was, how long this had been happening, whether things had changed slowly or all at once. A breeze swept through the leaves, brushing his skin with the faint scent of the nearby park, a smell he had always found calming, though tonight it only twisted deeper into his unease. Minutes passed. He couldn't tell how many. Time felt suspended, stretched thin and brittle like a thread that might snap at any second. Then, from somewhere down the street, a dog barked, sharp and sudden, dragging him back into the moment. He flinched, breath catching, and for the first time since arriving he questioned what he was doing. He had followed her into the night, watched her take another man's hand, chased a car through half the city, and now stood shivering beside a silent vehicle, waiting for something he wasn't sure he wanted to witness. He backed away slowly, pulse still racing, mind split between dread and a desperate need for answers. Part of him thought he should leave, that seeing anything more would carve deeper wounds than he was ready to bear. Another part insisted he stay, that turning away now would be the same as surrendering without knowing what exactly he was surrendering to. The conflict held him in place, suspended between fear and determination, while the night pressed close around him, patient and indifferent. And then lights flickered inside the car. Not much, just a brief shift, like someone adjusting their position or reaching for something. But it was enough to snap him to attention. He froze, breath lodged in his throat, eyes fixed on the faintest glow behind the tinted glass. More movement followed, subtle, indistinct, impossible to interpret. His heart hammered. Whatever was happening inside that car, it was real, immediate, and far beyond anything he had been prepared for. He stepped closer, not close enough to touch the car, but enough to feel the truth rising like a tide he could no longer hold back. The faint glow inside the car vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared, leaving the stranger's vehicle once again a dark, opaque shape beneath the swaying canopy of branches. He stood frozen, unsure whether the light had come from a phone screen, a dashboard switch, or something else entirely. The silence thickened, settling heavily over the street, over his shoulders, over the uncertainty tightening in his chest. It was strange how a moment so small, barely a flicker, could feel like a threshold. He sensed that whatever happened next would mark a point he couldn't return from. A line that once crossed would reshape everything he thought he knew about his life, his marriage, and the woman he believed he understood. He stepped back, needing space to think, but the ache in his chest followed him like a shadow. He leaned against the rough bark of a tree, breathing slowly, aware of how cold his hands had become. Only then did he notice how quiet the neighborhood was. No passing cars, no footsteps, no music bleeding from windows, just the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the city beyond. It felt as though the world had paused to make room for this moment, for his uncertainty, for the questions that refused to be spoken aloud. He tried to reason with himself, to imagine explanations that wouldn't tear everything apart. Maybe she had met the stranger for something innocent, something misguided but not unforgivable. Maybe she had followed him into the car only to talk away from the noise of the club. Maybe the flicker of light inside had been nothing more than her searching through her purse or checking her phone. He clung to each possibility, forcing the pieces to fit into shapes he could endure. But none of it matched her expression from earlier, the soft smile, the hesitation, the way she had allowed her hand to be taken, the unspoken conversation happening in the space between her and the stranger. Those memories chipped away at every justification he tried to construct. The minutes dragged. He shifted restlessly, torn between the urge to approach the car and the fear of what he might see if he did. When a gust of wind swept through the street, scattering leaves at his feet, it felt like the night nudging him forward, refusing to let him remain suspended in limbo. He straightened from the tree, steadying his breath as he stepped closer again. His pulse thudded in his ears, each beat a reminder of how fragile everything felt. He reached the curb, then the edge of the parked car, stopping just out of sight of the windows. The metal frame stood cold and silent, betraying nothing. A sudden sound broke the stillness, a muffled voice, too quiet to decipher but unmistakably human. His breath caught. The stranger's voice followed, low and even. The two sounds blended, rose, fell, slipped into a rhythm that made his stomach twist. He strained to separate the words, but the tinted glass swallowed them whole, leaving only vague impressions that teased the edges of his understanding. The murmur of conversation felt intimate, private. A world he had never been invited into yet was now forced to confront from the outside. He backed away instinctively, guilt and desperation tangling in his chest. He felt like an intruder, though he knew the true betrayal wasn't his. The guilt wasn't his. The weight of what he had heard, even without words, settled like cold stone beneath his ribs. He walked a few paces down the sidewalk, clenching and unclenching his fists, trying to steady the tremor that had crept into his fingers. The darkness pressed closer as he stopped once more, halfway between fleeing and returning, held by a need for clarity that overpowered his fear. Then, as though sensing his indecision, the car shifted. A subtle movement, the faint rock of weight changing inside. He turned sharply, eyes locked on the silhouette of the vehicle. Another muffled sound followed, not loud, just a small thud, as if something had brushed against the door. It was enough to send his thoughts spiraling again, each scenario sharper and more unbearable than the last. He felt his heartbeat accelerate, fear rising like a tide he could no longer hold back. He took a step toward the car, then stopped. Another step. Another. For a moment he thought he might finally walk right up to the window, press his hand to the cold glass, and force the truth into the open. But something held him back, something deeper than fear, a sense that once he saw what lay inside, there would be no turning away, no possibility of pretending it wasn't happening, no protection from the finality of certainty. The unknown was torture, but the truth might be irreversible. The decision was ripped from him by the sudden click of a door unlocking. He froze. The sound came from the stranger's car, sharp, mechanical, impossible to misinterpret. The interior light flickered on for a split second before dimming again. His breath vanished as the passenger door began to open, slowly, cautiously, as though whoever sat inside understood the weight of the moment that was about to spill into the street. He stood perfectly still, unable to move, unable to think, watching as the door inched open, revealing nothing yet but darkness and the faint outline of a figure preparing to step into the night. The door opened only a few inches at first, just enough for a sliver of interior light to escape before the stranger's car seemed to swallow it back into darkness. He couldn't see her face yet, only the suggestion of movement, the faintest outline of someone hesitating on the threshold. His body felt suspended between breaths, as if the night itself were holding him in place, unwilling to let him step forward or retreat. A cold tightness spread through his limbs, the same kind of paralyzing weight he'd felt years ago when receiving bad news he wasn't ready for. The human body, he realized, always knows before the mind accepts it. The figure inside shifted again. A silhouette leaned toward the open door, hands moving briefly, as though adjusting clothing or smoothing something out of sight. The interior light blinked a second time, illuminating only enough to show a forearm, a shoulder, the sway of hair he recognized instantly even in that fleeting flash. His heart lurched. She was there. She was emerging. And the gentle deliberateness of her movement told him everything he'd been trying not to believe. He stepped back without meaning to, as though distance could soften the impact of what was unfolding. His shoes scraped quietly against the pavement, a sound small enough to disappear into the night but loud enough, in his ears, to echo. He wondered if she might hear it, if she might glance up, meet his eyes, and freeze in the same disbelief that held him now. Part of him longed for that moment, the confrontation, the truth forced into the open, while another part dreaded it with equal intensity, because if she looked up and saw him, there would be no explaining. No turning away from what her presence in that car meant. The branches above rustled, scattering faint shadows over the sidewalk as she finally stepped out of the car. Her foot touched the ground first, tentative, as if testing the air, testing herself. Then her hand appeared, gripping the doorframe lightly, steadying her balance. When she rose fully into view, he almost didn't recognize her. Not because she looked different, but because she looked exactly like herself. The same posture, the same way she brushed stray strands of hair from her cheek, yet now those familiar gestures belonged to a moment he was never supposed to witness. She lingered at the open door, not closing it, not moving away from it, glancing back into the car with a softness that made his stomach hollow out. A second figure shifted behind her. The stranger's outline appeared just long enough to confirm his presence, tall, composed, leaning toward her with an ease that suggested no fear of being seen. He said something quiet to hear, but she reacted to it, her head tilting, her shoulders relaxing. The gentleness in her response cut deeper than any dramatic revelation could have. This wasn't impulsive or chaotic. It was intimate in a way that suggested history, connection, perhaps even comfort. She stepped further into the open air, wrapping her arms briefly around herself as the breeze swept across the street. He watched her exhale, watched the faint rise and fall of her breath, watched her turn slightly toward the sidewalk, slightly, but not enough to see him. He shrank back behind the tree instinctively, pressing into the shadow like someone trying to become part of the night itself. He could see her clearly from this angle, the slight tremor in her stance, the way she looked up at the sky as if trying to make sense of her own choices. For a moment, vulnerability flickered across her features, a trace of conflict he hadn't expected to find. But then the stranger stepped out as well, closing the door behind him, and whatever uncertainty she carried slipped away beneath the quiet assurance of his presence. The stranger said something again, still inaudible, still intimate, and she lifted her face toward him. Her expression softened. She nodded, a small, decisive motion that felt louder in his chest than any sound could have. The two of them began to walk toward the sidewalk, their steps slow, unhurried, as though they were discussing something that required careful thought. They weren't holding hands now, but there was a closeness between them, a gravity in the space they shared that spoke of secrets exchanged long before tonight. He retreated further around the tree, pulse pounding. Their path would bring them directly past where he hid. If he moved now, if he stepped out into the street or back toward his car, they would see him. But the idea of remaining where he stood, silent, unseen, reduced to a witness in his own unraveling, felt unbearable. His breaths came shallow and rapid, each one colder than the last. The night had narrowed to a single question: confront the truth openly or let it pass by him like a storm he was too weak to stand under. Their voices grew nearer, still indistinct but closer, close enough that he could hear the cadence even if not the words. Her tone was low, thoughtful. The stranger's was steady. They weren't laughing now. They weren't whispering. They were speaking like to people discussing something real, something important, something shared. His heart slammed against his ribs. They were nearly at the tree, nearly beside him, nearly close enough to see everything. He closed his eyes for a single, fragile second, and when he opened them, she stepped into the patch of light that spilled through the branches, and for the first time that night, her face shifted sharply, her eyes widening just slightly, as though she sensed something in the dark. She slowed. The stranger looked at her in question. She was turning her head toward him, toward the shadows where he stood, breath held, heart exposed, the truth seconds away from colliding with them all. Asterisk for a fraction of a second. The world held still, the kind of silence that feels carved out of time itself. She stood in the patch of pale, shifting light, her face angled just enough that her eyes caught the darkness where he hid. Something in her expression tightened, a subtle contraction of awareness, recognition, fear, or guilt, he couldn't tell. It flickered too quickly to define, but it was there. He saw it. And she saw something too, even if she didn't fully understand what had drawn her attention. Her step faltered, her breath paused, her hand lifted slightly, as if to shield her eyes or reach for something she couldn't quite name. But she didn't speak, she didn't call out, she didn't come closer. The stranger noticed her shift immediately. He turned toward her, his silhouette blocking part of her face from view, his voice soft but questioning. She answered with a small shake of her head, a quick glance around as though convincing herself it had been nothing more than a trick of shadow, a passing instinct. Her shoulders rose with a slow inhale, then lowered with forced composure. Whatever moment of hesitation she'd felt dissolved beneath an expression he had never seen her wear before, not indifference, not defiance, but something quieter, heavier, as though she had already accepted the consequences of choices she had not yet been confronted with. He remained still, pressed against the rough bark of the tree, fingers curled so tightly into his palms that he couldn't feel them anymore. He wanted to step out. He wanted to say her name. He wanted the truth to break open so that both of them could finally stop drowning in the silence between what was known and what was feared. But the fear that had followed him all night, the fear of what her eyes would show him once she realized he was there, held him in place. The truth might have freed him, but it might also have shattered whatever remained of the life they had built. And in that fragile, suspended moment, he wasn't sure which possibility he was more afraid of. The stranger touched her arm gently, guiding her attention back to him. She didn't pull away. She let her gaze settle on him, allowed her posture to soften again, allowed herself to follow his lead as they walked past the tree and down the quiet street. He tracked every step, every shift of her shoulders, every meaningless fragment of conversation drifting back toward him, fragmented words with no shape, only suggestion, carried on the wind. As they moved farther from him, the ache in his chest deepened, not with shock anymore, but with a hollow, profound sense of inevitability. He stayed hidden until they turned the corner, disappearing from sight. Only then did his body unlock, the tension draining from him all at once, leaving a cold, trembling weakness behind. He sank onto the curb, elbows resting on his knees, breathing slow and uneven. The street felt impossibly wide, the night impossibly large. He stared at the ground, at the faint shimmer of streetlights skimming across fallen leaves, at the point where their footsteps had last touched the pavement. The world had not changed, yet everything inside him had. Minutes passed before he rose again. He walked back toward his car without looking over his shoulder, unwilling to witness anything more than he already had. Every step felt heavy, as if the pavement itself resisted letting him go. When he reached his car, he paused with his hand on the door, leaning his forehead against the cool metal. He listened to the quiet. No laughter, no engines, no voices. Just a deep, unbroken stillness folding around him like a reminder that some truths arrive without sound, without confrontation, without a single spoken word, and yet they change everything. When he finally drove away, he didn't follow the route the stranger's car had taken. He drove aimlessly through the city instead, passing familiar streets that looked unfamiliar now, illuminated by a version of the night he had never wanted to see. He watched lights blur at the edges of his vision, watched crowds outside late-night cafes, watched couples walking close beneath awnings. Everything looked normal, ordinary, untouched, but the dissonance of it all pressed into him until he felt hollow. Home felt distant, but he went there anyway, eventually. The keys trembled in his hand as he unlocked the door. Inside, the living room greeted him with the same arrangement of cushions, the same framed photographs, the same quiet warmth he had once taken comfort in. But now even the familiar objects felt like evidence of a life paused in the moment just before impact. He walked inside without turning on the lights, letting the dark settle around him. He sat down on the edge of the couch and closed his eyes. He didn't know what would come next, what she would say, What he would ask, what words could possibly bridge the chasm that had opened between them. Maybe she would come home with excuses, maybe with honesty, maybe with nothing at all. But the truth he had witnessed tonight, regardless of its details, lived now between them like a door that had finally swung open after years of quiet strain. He opened his eyes again, staring into the stillness of the room. The night had not given him answers. It had given him something far harder to face. And now morning would come, carrying whatever truth she chose to bring with it.